Well, good afternoon, Matt. Lovely to see you on the other end of Skype on this afternoon, and we're getting closer and closer, of course, to the reopening of the museums at this stage. So, obviously, quite a busy time for you, but always time to have a chat and a look at some of Limerick sporting history. And of course, today we're going to have a look at the history of the golf clubs in Limerick and in surrounding areas and the ones that are attached. And it's an absolutely fascinating story as to how they would have developed over the years. So, Matt, lovely to have you. I am talking, of course, to Dr. Matthew Potter, who's curator of Limerick Museum and based down there in the Old Franciscan Church. So, Matt, lovely to have you here. Golf, of course, Matt, is a sport that has really taken off again as a leisure sport, I suppose, over the many years. But its development, I suppose, is shrouded in the mists of history, but definitely of a Scottish origin.
Correct. Golf is commonly known as the gift from Scotland because, as you rightly pointed out, it originated in Scotland. Like a lot of sports, like hurling, like soccer, like rugby, it claims a very long pedigree. But in actual fact, it came into existence in its modern form in the 1740s, when the Company of Edinburgh Golfers was established in 1744. This was the first golf club in the world. And most importantly of all, they established written rules of the game. This is the first time that there were proper rules for the game of golf. And then in 1766, the St Andrews Club, the most famous club in the world, was established. And golf then spread, like a religion in many respects, all over the world. And it was often brought by Scottish missionary golfers, you might call them, who actually brought the game to the four corners of the globe. And of course, the Scots played a major role in the British Empire. So that was how golf spread so widely. And of course, Ireland was no exception in that it was largely due to Scottish military officers, members of the Scots diaspora in Ireland. It was they who actually brought golf all over Ireland. And if you look, for example, at the development of golf in Ireland, it was mentioned as having been played in Bray, County Wicklow, was early 1762, but really it was the 1850s it took off in Ireland.
And strangely, because it was brought by, obviously through military means in many instances, it was never regarded as a foreign game from GA purposes. No,
there was one of the main difficulties that occurred over the playing of games were that the GA was played on a Sunday, which was against the Sabbatarian beliefs of many Protestant groups at that period. They then would have played their particular games on a Saturday. But in the case of golf, because it wasn't particularly tied to any day of the week, it didn't seem to cause the same difficulties. And I suppose the Catholic clergy had a major role in the development and dissemination of GA as well. Many of them were keen golfers, so perhaps that has something to do with the fact that golf never attracted the wrath of the GA in the same manner as rugby and soccer and so on.
So we come to in around the mid 1880s in Ireland, and I suppose golf was becoming established there. We have a report of a link directly to what's now Áras an Uachtaráin, actually, haven't we?
We have, because the Royal Curragh Golf Club in Kildare, it claims that it was established in 1858, so it claims to be the oldest golf club in Ireland. But it seems that history records that there may not have been a golf club in the Curragh, but there certainly were golfers, Scottish Army officers. And then Lord Eglinton, who was a Scottish Viceroy of Ireland in the 1850s, he also played golf in what is now Áras an Uachtaráin, the Vice-Regal Lodge, the grounds of the Vice-Regal Lodge. But in the 1880s, Scottish Army officers established a golf course in Phoenix Park, and it was played there for a number of years. And in fact, when the first modern golf club, by the way, in Ireland was Belfast, the Royal Belfast in 1881, and then the second one was the Royal Dublin in 1885. But the Royal Dublin Golf Club initially played in Phoenix Park, and then it moved elsewhere. So golf was very much associated from the very beginning with the Scottish community in Ireland and with the Scottish military establishment.
So we're kind of up to the mid-1880s, and a number of clubs have been established at this stage. And while it may have emerged in Scotland, the first organisation, I suppose, to look after golf on a national basis anywhere in the world was formed in Ireland, and that was the Golfing Union of Ireland, and that was 1891?
1891. there was a golf boom in Ireland in the 1890s. 103 golf clubs were established throughout the country during this period. And the Golfing Union of Ireland was established in 1891, as you pointed out, the oldest national golfing body in the world. And golf continued to boom then up until 1914, by which time there were 190 clubs in Ireland. If you think there are about 400 golf clubs in Ireland now at the moment, you can see how the initial surge was of vital importance to the establishment of golf in Ireland at this period.
Over past weeks, we've been talking very much, I suppose, about the other sports that have taken root in Limerick. And really, we do have a claim to be the sporting capital with the way things were set up. And, you know, everything from, I suppose, from boat clubs all the way through to rugby clubs and soccer clubs and every sort of other club. And of course, cricket being the precursor of all of them, amazingly. But I suppose when it comes to golf, the same names emerge as emerged in many of the other clubs in Limerick, and they would have been the merchant classes of Limerick, but also, of course, then also backed, I suppose, by the regiments that were, by complete accident, I suppose, that were here in Limerick and based in Limerick, the Black Watch being one of them.
That's correct. I think if we were to speak about Limerick being the sporting capital, in some respects you could argue that Sir Alex Shaw was the father of sporting in Limerick in many respects, in that he founded Limerick Golf Club, he founded Lahinch Golf Club, he was instrumental in establishing the Limerick Rugby Club, which was one of the first rugby clubs in the area. He was also involved in athletics. He was also involved in the establishment of the rowing clubs. So I think that Sir Alex Shaw is central to all of the narrative of the development of organised sports in Limerick at the second half of the 19th century. And of course, as you rightly point out, it's the interaction between Scottish visitors to Limerick and Scottish residents to Limerick and the local gentry and the local merchant class that brought about the establishment of golf in Limerick, because in 1888 a family named Murray came from Scotland to live in Castleconnell at Prospect House, and Mrs. Murray had been married before, and she'd been married to a gentleman called Mr. Driver. It's D-R-I-V-E-R, which is rather appropriate considering that we're talking about golf. And the three sons, her three boys, the three Driver boys, brought golf to Limerick. They joined then the Limerick County Club, which was the local club for the Limerick gentry, and which was situated at what is now the Augustinian Friary on O'Connell Street in Limerick. There, the three Driver brothers met members of the officers of the Black Watch Regiment, which, as you stated, were stationed in Limerick at the time. So then you had these three Scottish boys, you had the Scottish officers. Between them all, and they interested many of members of the county club in the idea of playing golf, and in that manner, the seed was planted. And then, shortly afterwards, then, on December 12th, 1891, a meeting was held in the library of the old Athenaeum building, Seth Street, and it was there that the decision was taken to establish Limerick Golf Club, which in fact was the third golf club in the 32 counties and the first golf club in the south of Ireland. And again, the meeting was presided over by Alex Shaw. He became the first president of the club, he became the first captain of the club, and another well-known local businessman, Edward G. Fitz, whose family controlled the Limerick Savings Bank for many years, he became the first secretary of the club. And in honour of Mr. Driver, one of the three brothers who was instrumental in importing golf to Limerick, one of the three brothers, he was made an honorary member of the club. And it was sort of this kind of synergy between the Scots and the local business community and gentry that got golf off the ground in Limerick.
I suppose nowadays we view Limerick Golf Club, and it's associated with Ballyclough, and that's the area of Limerick where it exists. But it hasn't always been that way, and there was links even into County Clare and down into Lahinch. That's
right. For the first 15 or so years of its existence, more even, Limerick Golf Club wandered all over the place. And to begin with, the golf club rented some land in as part adjoining the Limerick racecourse. It proved to be too expensive. Then they moved to Ballinacurra, and there were problems there as well. In the meantime, some of the Black Watch officers had discovered Lahinch, and they went down there playing golf, and they returned to Limerick, and they told their fellow golfers in Limerick that Lahinch would be a brilliant, a fantastic location for a golf club. Some of the members of Limerick Golf Club went down then to Lahinch. They were also taken with the site, and at one stage then it was decided that they were going to actually move Limerick Golf Club lock, stock and barrel to Lahinch. However, that didn't go ahead. The Limerick Golf Club remained in Limerick, but of course Sir Alex Shaw then devoted a great deal of his energies into the establishment of Lahinch Golf Club. So you could see that Lahinch was established the year after Limerick. This was in 1892. So the two golf clubs developed very much in tandem, and there was a tendency then for the golfing fraternity in Limerick to play golf in Limerick during the winter and then decamp to Lahinch during the summer. So after the failure of the proposal to move the club to Lahinch, they then ended up outside in part of the county tennis club and cricket ground, which was out Dennis Road, which adjoined what is now St. Camillus' Hospital, but which at the time was the Union Workhouse.
And this might be just a good time as well, just to interject, Matt. And we've had a number of queries regarding that particular piece of ground and the origin of the Grocer's Field, which is another piece of ground that we hadn't mentioned heretofore in any of our pieces. But it would appear, and through the good offices of your friend and mine, Tom Toomey, and through the library services in Limerick, that it has been confirmed that the Grocer's Field was part of the land that is now situated between St. Camillus, what is St. Camillus is now, and the Limerick Lawn Tennis Club. That land was known as the Grocer's Field.
That's right, and of course it's obviously it was built over subsequently and became housing. But the Grocer's Field didn't work out for two reasons. One is that one day Sir Charles Barrington, who again was one of the local gentry of Glenstall Castle and one of the pioneers of rugby in Limerick, but he also was one of the pioneers of golf in Limerick. He was playing a game of golf in the Grocer's Field with G.E. Goodbody, one of the local millers, and one of them hit a golf club which broke the window of the maternity unit in the Union Hospital. So that didn't go down very well, as you can imagine. Neither did the fact that the tennis club complained that their tennis courts were being uprooted by the golfers.
They weren't replacing divots, so Matt.
No, I'm afraid not. No, they were more or less asked to leave, and then they ended up in another very historic site, which was Newcastle and Castletroy, and that was historic for a number of reasons. One, it was near the site of Limerick Racecourse for over 100 years, up to 1868, before it moved to Green Park. Secondly, of course, it was adjoining what is now Castletroy Golf Club, which was not to be established, of course, until 1937.
And we had mentioned that land previously as part of the old Limerick Racecourse, which would have been correct. Close by in those days as well.
Very much so. So their sojourn there was also quite brief. They then moved to Ballysheedy. They then moved to a Hogan's Farm in Ballinacurra, and it wasn't until 1908 that they found their way to Ballyclough. And it would have been Richard Furnell, who was another member of the county club and therefore would have been well known to Barrington and to Alex Shaw, who offered them land there, which he rented to them. And a nine-hole golf course was established there.
And it should be noted as well that when we talk about Ballyclough now, you know, we almost have a conurbation that goes all the way out there and even right. beyond, and Fedamore and those areas are all within reach. But Ballyclough would have been very much on the extremity of town at that point, wouldn't it? Very much so, because really the Limerick city built-up area, it stopped more or less at the Ballinacurra Creek, for example. So there was it was countryside once you left Ballinacurra, and as you rightly point out, Ballyclough was effectively out in the middle of the countryside.
And the trouble with this golf course, of course, was that it was just costing quite a lot to develop it. So the membership subscriptions were raised around 1908 as well. So the gentlemen now members had to pay £2 a year and ladies £1 per year. While that might sound rather quaint to the modern listener or viewer, that was quite a substantial sum in those days. But then in 1919, the farm on which the present course is situated came on the market, and Limerick Golf Club purchased it from the late Mrs. Crawford. And it took a long time to get it into shape, but in March 1920, it opened for play as a 9-hole golf course. It was then extended to an 18-hole golf course in 1928. And then finally, in 1937, they acquired more land from Mrs. Crawford's estate, and the present layout effectively was established at that point.
And it's an absolutely beautiful course out there. Moving on from there then, Matt, and we made reference to it a little earlier on. Suddenly and almost without reason, Castletroy Golf Club then emerged a little bit later on than that, didn't it?
It did, yeah. I suppose I just briefly want to mention before we go to that some of the presidents of Limerick Golf Club, just to show you the kind of people who pioneered golf in Limerick in the late 19th, early 20th century. Sir Alex Shaw was the first president of Limerick. He was then succeeded by Sir Charles Barrington, who held the position from 1902 to 1927. Then he was followed by Major Richard de Ross Rose, who lived near Limerick City, who had fought in the First World War, had been severely wounded, had been decorated for gallantry at the Battle of Cambrai, and whose wounds were so severe that he died actually quite young in 1939 at the age of 50. And it's interesting to note, and this is now where I'm about to tie into the Castletroy Golf Club being established, that with Major de Ross Rose's replacement as president in 1937 by Philip Tracy. He was a very wealthy and well-known local businessman in Limerick, but he was a Catholic. So this was the sort of the turning point where the old gentry and the old Protestant elite were giving away to the Catholic professionals and business people. And it was in this context then that Castletroy was established in 1936, 37. Interestingly though, that the Shaws had a big part in this as well, because what happened was there was a meeting called in the Glenfield Hotel in Limerick, at which it was decided that a second golf club should be established in the city. And at the time, a few people said, we don't really need a second golf club in Limerick, because there's only 239 men and 116 lady members of Limerick Golf Club at this period. But in fact, Castletroy Golf Club, ironically, in view of the fact that I just, after mentioning the fact that it was there was a transition from the old Protestant elite to the new Catholic elite, it actually was two sons of Sir Alex Shaw who got Castletroy Golf Club off the ground. And these were Malcolm Shaw, who was the proprietor of the Limerick Bacon Factory, the Shaw's Bacon Factory, and his brother Captain Eric Shaw, who was another veteran, of course, of the First World War. They provided the necessary funds, and by their involvement then, other funds were made available then because of the example they set, and Castletroy Golf Club then was established in 1937. It, of course, also wandered around, or at least it took a while for Castletroy to be chosen as the home of this particular golf club, because initially they looked at Castleconnell, they looked at Ballycommon in Mungret, and it was only eventually because so many of the potential members of the club were living in what was then the very new suburb of Castletroy. It was that really, and the availability, of course, of land that prompted them to establish their home in Castletroy.
It's interesting that Castleconnell has featured now in both the establishment of Limerick and in Castletroy golf clubs, and that it was considered for both, and it didn't wind up with either. And yet the two golf clubs were situated albeit at different times, 2 fields apart from each other at one stage or another. But that's neither.
Yep.
Just to go back to our friend de Ross Rose, he was the owner of Ardoo House as well, wasn't he?
Correct. He was, and he gave his name then to Roses Avenue on Guinness Road. And he would have been, his family would have lived in the area for quite a number for several decades, in fact. And but he was the last of his line because, as I say, he died prematurely in 1939. But you can see, and again, when we come in a minute to look at Adair, you can see the kind of person who was involved in the establishment of the golf in Limerick and indeed nationwide.
Would it be fair to say at this stage that at this point in history, up to kind of the mid-1930s, the golf was still very much in the upper classes? The working man really didn't play golf at that point.
No, not at all, no. In fact, not only that, but it was actually very much associated with the Protestant community and with the old landed elite. It took a long time for even the Catholic professionals and business people to make their mark. As I say, symbolised to some degree by the presidency of Philip Tracy. He became president of Limerick Golf Club in 1937. But even so, the Shaws continued to play a major role, for example, then in Castletroy Golf Club for a long time after it was established. And if we then look at, for example, at Lahinch, Lahinch owed its existence to the activity of Sir Alex Shaw. And I should point out at this stage, what's very interesting is, and we look at it again when we talk about Adair, the likes of Sir Alex Shaw and Lord Reagan, they had access to the best expertise of the day, because in 1894, when a Hinch Golf Club was being laid out, Sir Alex Shaw commissioned no less a man than old Tom Morris, a legendary Scottish golfer, who was actually been the subject of a film, no less. He and his son, young Tom Morris, had a fraught relationship. But old Tom Morris is regarded as being the founder of modern golf in many respects. Because he decided that there should be 18 holes in the golf course, for example. And he also was the first, he was the founder of the whole concept of maintenance, of greenkeeping and all that kind of thing.
And he also identified that Lahinch, and in his own words, was the finest natural course that he had ever walked.
Correct. And I mean, when you think of what a compliment that was, because he was associated with St Andrews for much of his life, which was then, as now, the leading golf club in the world. So, and then when Adair was designed, it was Ben Sayers, another world-class Scottish golfer and designer of golf courses, that was commissioned to do that. So the fact that you had the gentry involved, people of considerable wealth and influence, they were able to bring in the best expertise, not just merely in Ireland, but in the world at the time. They literally went to the fountainhead, back to Scotland itself, to get what we now describe as world-class advice and expertise in the design of their golf courses.
Well, you've circled the wagons a number of times at this stage, Matt, around Adair, so I think we better get you onto the first tee box out there at this point. Yes. Because, of course, it does have its origins, as you've pointed out, in all of what went before, in terms of Limerick and Lahinch and Adair. They're kind of a trilogy, aren't they?
They are. Actually, a friend of mine called Milo Spillane, he has written the history of Adair Golf Club from 1991 to 2000, and he said, in his book, which is an excellent read, he said that Limerick, Lahinch and Adair Golf Clubs, it was essentially the same people who were involved in all three, and they just put on a different hat, and they played sometimes in Adair, sometimes in Lahinch and sometimes in Limerick. And if you look at Adair Golf Club, which was established in 1900, first president was the Earl of Dunraven. First vice president was, guess who? Sir Alex Shaw again. And again, of course, the Scots came into it. The first secretary of Adair Golf Club was a man called Robert Ballingal, who was the estate manager, a young Scotsman. And I mentioned that Ben Sayers was the designer of Adair Golf Club, but it was Robert Ballingal who actually carried out the work of laying out Adair Golf Club in accordance with the design of Ben Sayers. And Robert Ballingal then, in 1908, was called upon by Sir Alex Shaw to do a similar job on Limerick Golf Club. So you can see that there was this synergy between the Scots and the local elite, and it really was done at a very high level. And the golf club was originally, of course, a 9-hole golf club as well. It didn't become actually 18 holes until 1992. And one of the difficulties, I suppose, that did arise was that it was within the Dunraven estate. It was called the Adair Manor Golf Club, of course. And then when Lord Dunraven in 1980 announced his intention of selling the manor and the estate, it was necessary then for the golf club to be safeguarded. So Lord Dunraven then sold the golf club and the ground and the whole lot to Adair Golf Club. And it was from that time onwards then that the golf club developed very rapidly.
And of course, not to be confused, that's the Adair Manor Golf Club. And Adair Golf Club is attached to the manor, which is a little confusing in general, isn't it?
It very much so, actually, yes. And actually, the poor postman, I think, must get very confused between the two, because when Adair Manor was turned into a hotel in the 1990s, a golf course was laid out there in 1995. I should also point out, of course, then that one of the many interesting aspects of the history of Adair Golf Club is that the only golf club possibly in the world that has religious service held once a year, for which it closes down. And this goes back to the Methodist involvement with Adair, because John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, preached in Adair in 1756. He preached actually on the site of the present Adair Manor Golf Club, and there's a plaque there. And the Methodists then have what they call a field meetings, where they have an annual meeting in various open air settings. And this commemorates the fact that when the Methodists began in the 18th century, they often preached out in the open because they were not approved of by the local Anglicans. So they still have these meetings, and once a year during the summer, the Methodists have their field meeting in Adair Golf Club, near where John Wesley preached in 1756, or at least he was there in 1756. He was back several times after that as well. So it's the only golf club in the world that closes down for a religious service. And there's also, of course, occasional masses held as well then in the Franciscan friary in the grounds of Adair Golf Club. So in many respects, it's a pretty unique golf course.
Yeah, and a beautiful setting as well, of course, there along the banks of the river, and of course set on the grounds almost of Adair Manor as well. And of course, Adair and its golf courses are going to come to the fore. If we ever get rid of this accursed COVID, we can start focusing once again on the Ryder Cup, which of course is due to come to Adair in 2026, and I suppose will be historic as well from that perspective. So we've looked at all of these golf clubs. Now there are other golf clubs, of course, around that have set up, and we're obviously limited time wise and all of that. And perhaps on another day we might look at the likes of Newcastle West and Kilkee and the other great golf courses. But I suppose within the city bounds or just outside the city bounds, there are two other golf courses as well, which are of a more modern vintage, and I think probably should be mentioned.
Definitely, yes. I suppose to take them chronologically, Ballyneety Golf Club was established in 1994, and unfortunately it had to close in 2011, but it was resurrected in 2013 by a very dedicated committee, and it's now flourishing again. So it's an example, I suppose, of the manner in which you could almost say it symbolises the manner in which both the entire country and Limerick in particular came back from the crash of 2008, which had in fact precipitated the collapse of the club. And
ironically, and we spoke about the merchant classes of Limerick and the great families of Limerick, there is a direct link back into probably one of the most famous Limerick merchant classes and aristocracy of Limerick in the Croker family out there.
That's right, because the actual the famous Croker family of Ballynagard had quite a substantial estate in that area, and part of it forms the golf course in Adair, or in Ballyneety, sorry. I suppose then, as I work for Limerick City and County Council, it would be very remiss of me not to mention Rathban Golf Club, which opened in 1998, because of course it's a municipal golf club. And Ireland hasn't too many of them compared to the continent of Europe or Britain. Golf clubs that are owned by local authorities, they're much more common in other countries. We tend to have golf clubs that are private entities. But Limerick, Limerick Corporations was at the time in 1998 established a municipal golf club in Rathban. And if my memory serves me right, the former mayor of Limerick, the late Jack Burke, was the first captain of Rathban Golf Club, and it continues to flourish, of course. And it's a very worthwhile initiative, and it continues to be run by and owned by Limerick City and County Council.
And a little fact that I found out in researching this particular programme was that there's a direct link to the Markets Field as well with that, in that the agronomist that laid out the course originally was James Healy, and James was our first agronomist here in the Markets Field after we did the works. So there's another direct link between James and the golf club in Rathban and here in the Markets Field as well. Matt, it's been fascinating. We could talk about golf all day. We haven't really talked about the personalities, I suppose, or the competitions that have been involved. The evolution, I suppose, of golf from being very much part of the merchant classes and the regiments that were involved. And that's something that I wanted to refer back to, again, in terms of linking all of this stuff together, because there's one thing that I've discovered over all of our talks is that everything in history, particularly from the 1860s on, from a local perspective, everything is interlinked. We look at the Black Watch. I mean, the Black Watch was the first regiment to play one of the first registered soccer match in the Markets Field back in 1891, where they played the Lancashire Fusiliers in a match. So the linkage is back, and you can imagine that at that time they were also looking at Lahinch Golf Club. Probably the same personalities even within that regiment were the same people that were playing the soccer and that were involved in the sport and were involved in that. And I think maybe in some ways we've airbrushed a lot of that because of the whole nationalist question. We've airbrushed a lot of that from our history. And it's very interesting to go back and look at it. I mean, without poking too much, I suppose, into those areas. But we very much were, when it came to the development of sport, very much were a garrison city, I suppose, at that time, that had a big effect on the way in which we developed. But also, I suppose a lot of the merchant classes were coming into their own at that time as well. Wouldn't that be correct to say?
Very much so, yes. I suppose the fact that what's called the sporting revolution of 1850 to 1900, when modern sport was established, that sporting revolution began in Britain and then, of course, spread all over the world. And because we were so close to Britain in that we were just a neighbouring island, we were inevitably one of the first parts of the world to be influenced by that sporting revolution. But if you look at large areas of the globe that weren't on the British route, like Latin America, for example, where soccer was imported by various British expatriates and then became the national game in all of the Latin American countries, from Mexico down as far as Chile and Argentina, it would have been very hard for us not to have been influenced by the sporting revolution in Britain. And the other thing, of course, was that even the GAA, which was established more or less as a reaction to British sport, it actually borrowed an awful lot of the ideology of the British sporting revolution, the idea of having an organised national body, having a set of rules that everybody had to adhere to, the concept of the sports club, which was the main vector for carrying sport all over the place. It is very hard. It would be very hard to escape the influence of Britain on world sport. I suppose one of the few countries that established its own suite of indigenous sports. There were only two countries really that did that, and they were Ireland with the Gaelic games, and the United States with all its own particular games like baseball and basketball and American football and so on. So I suppose we can be very proud here in Ireland of the fact that though we were influenced by the British sporting revolution, we were one of the few countries that carved out our own niche. We didn't just take on what they had given us. We put our own stamp on it.
Absolutely, Matt. As always, it's been fascinating. Once again, your museum is reopening on the 29th of June, and you'll be looking for footfall through the door at that stage. And there's many fascinating sporting exhibits in there, as well as other fascinating items to go and look at. And they might even catch a glimpse of yourself while they're wandering through there as well.
They just might, yes. Even though I might be wearing a mask, but other than that, I'll still be recognisable, I'm sure, you know.
Matt, as always, thank you very much, and it's been fascinating.
Thank you very much, then. Thank you.
God bless.
Right.